Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the state of Corralt Ghislaine. And yes, we're actually finally back with Fall of Light. Book 3, chapters 17 and 18 is what I read today for the third time. I'll get into that in a second. I'm mostly glad that I finally got around to actually recording this video. And my plan is to finish the entirety of books 3 and 4 during this week. We'll see how well that goes. But let's just get started, shall we? Cheers. So yeah, I read chapters 17 and 18 last Monday, and then I didn't have time to actually record the video, and decided to record it on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, I reread them because I couldn't remember what I wanted to say. So I reread those two chapters. And then life intervened, and I didn't get around to recording the video again. And yeah, then I just, gave up for the rest of the week with Fall of Light. I needed to get a new headphone dongle for my iPhone and all of that stuff. So I just gave the last week, made a break from from Fall of Light. But today I read them for the third time while doing my morning workout, and I figured it's now or never we're gonna do this. Chapters 17 and 18. There's a lot going on there that I figure may be interesting to talk about. First thing is when we begin chapter 17, we obviously see the planning of the attack on the Yanis monastery, and yeah, how that kind of goes about. Well, something that is important there, I guess, is the whole idea of efficiency and how that goes hand in hand oftentimes with a loss of morals, and is because if you make efficiency your number one goal, and that's what Caliban has done, in with that story that he tells about the Jellic killing the dogs and all of that. The point there is efficiency is a different way of is a different metric. Efficiency is a physical metric, a mathematical metric. It's like you look at how much effort you may put in to get as much out of whatever activity it is we're talking about. And those things have nothing to do with morals. Most likely they will be highly immoral, because morals are what you might call our human decency intervening in the application of cold mathematics to maximize profits, which is why the idea of a market, of a free market, doesn't work as well as it should, because the goal of companies in free market capitalism is to maximize money, maximize their winnings, maximize profit, as you might say. And they don't care about working conditions or anything like that. That's why absolute free market is is an illusion or a horror story. Anyway, this is not where this story is going, obviously, but I just wanted to mention that the idea that efficiency and the appeal of efficiency is treacherous, because what it mostly does is makes us try to get the most out of everything for the least effort, and gives us leave to ignore morality in a way. That's the main issue there, that human beings, being kind of moral creatures by definition, by nature, we need to overcome our innate goodness is probably the wrong word, but our innate morality. We need to overcome that by arguments. And efficiency is one of those arguments. And necessity is another one of those arguments that we put in to argue ourselves out of doing the right thing, I would say. We also see, obviously, like a small aside with Khaled Bahan when he murders, well, executes all the returning scouts for cowardice. We see him like projecting his own fear and cowardice, projecting that, and by punishing it very, very hard in his in his soldiers. But I don't want to go too deep into that. I just found it interesting to see. Anyway, what we then have is something that I found very important. That's a conversation between those different nobles, that about when they see Warlord Resh and Kaplo Dream and Pharaoh Hand. No, not Pharaoh Hand, Finara Stone. I always confuse those two. It's terrible when you see them, when they see those three approaching. And the main thing there, I feel, is something that we see and can see in a lot of things in our world as well, is that once we've reached a certain level of privilege and power or whatever, the elites are very much consumed by their own power gains, and those make them kind of blind to the overall, like the larger threat. We see that with those two couples of nobles scheming against each other, scheming against Hishtula and so forth, and by that whole thing ignoring the entire like threat of the civil war that is very, very real. And this is something that we've seen a lot in our time, in our world as well. It's like, whether it is the super rich elite of whatever country you live in, or whether it is the most powerful, wealthy countries in the world being completely blind to the overall global threats that climate change, global pandemics, and what have you actually mean. It is always that idea that once you've reached a certain level of privilege, you become blind, willfully blind to the larger picture, because your reality has shifted so far away from any kind of other reality in a lot of ways. And we see that happening here with the nobles, which is one of the other explanations to see why that will gather overall, I guess, on why the civil war in Coralt Galen is so bloody and dumb, like mostly dumb and bloody and terrible. It is very much a perfect storm of all kinds of ignorance, stupidity, and personal grievances and shit like that. That's usually the case with all kinds of civil wars and all kinds of wars in general. So we see all of that. We then see the attack on the monastery. We see Sergeant Threadbare trying to warn the monastery and being stopped by, I presume, tourists, because like the way it's written, we see kind of that the ice the horse slipped on is weirdly arbitrary in that situation, and we kind of get another picture of Therese as an Azathanai with like a very loose grip on Corel Galen's realities and whatnot. But apparently she's playing her own game, whatever that may be. And I hope we'll see more of her so we get like a clearer idea of how, all of that stuff. I'm just hoping. I have no idea what will happen in the next couple of chapters. Anyway, I just felt that was like an interesting, one of those points that I feel we need to talk about later on. I think I spoke about that before already. The fact that the more we see Azathanai meddling in the fates of Corel Galen, the more I feel like it's easier to blame what happens in Corellia Lane on those outside influences and not something that is inherent in Teist society, which it I feel is, because the economic pressures and all of that of like a feudal society, they are like very much innate, and it's Zathanine meddling may kind of give some parts of Thai society a moral out by blaming those Azathanai for what happened. If that makes any sense. No. So that's something that I, felt was a bit weird there. Then we have, obviously, something that we need to talk about, Lahanis and Yeda Narat, and later on Glyph for a couple of like sentences. The idea of like lost innocence, or the idea of innocence in childhood, is one that obviously we've seen a lot in Stephen Erickson's writing, whether it is in the Malazan Book of the Fallen or The God Is Not Willing with Rant there, or now here in like different ways. The idea that up to a specific age, children are, I don't want to say in a state of nature because that's a very difficult term to use, but children are kind of unaware, blissfully unaware of a lot of the realities of the world, or can ignore them because they have not yet been pounded into form by society. Children, or that seems to be part of the thesis, are have an intuitive grasp on wrong and right, or good and evil. I would want to call it wrong, like moral wrong and moral right, stuff like that. And apart from that, they have a lot of like, yeah, a lot of innocence in a way, and the process of growing up is to leave that behind in all kinds of ways, maybe keeping it, and so forth. And we see that with Lahanis and her being forced into killing people now, and having like undergone a lot of trauma when her like border sword family got slaughtered and everything, and it has turned her into what I would call a psychopath. I mean, not to use any medical definitions here, but she certainly shows pathological behavior in her like need to kill, to maybe, yeah, because it's kind of like the only thing in her personality at that point. But she intuitively still understands the idea of the value of childhood, which is what she kind of tries to explain to Narat when he talks about what he did to Orphantal and how he got like beaten down, like beaten unconscious. It's like, well, wouldn't like a little, like just one punch, wouldn't that have been enough? Because I knew what I was doing wrong, and it was just like, yeah, wouldn't that have been enough? And Lahanis explaining, he was still in his summer because that's like her metaphor there, but the idea that that childlike innocence, or this that childhood innocence of someone like Orphantal, or obviously she's kind of, that's like what we need to, what is kind of implied, that she's also talking about herself in that situation, by talking about Orphantal. And the point being that we that destroying that, willfully destroying that without any kind of reason, there's no necessity for it, it's just personal cruelty on a rat's behalf, or not on a rat's behalf, but like for a rat it's only willful cruelty. And the point is that there is no excuse for that, and that is one of the ultimate, like, I don't want to call it ultimate sin, because sin is once again like a theological term that has all these other connotations, but the point is, it is almost that. It's like the ultimate crime is to take away that child's innocence before it, reaches the actual, age where these things slowly change, because we become adults and our brains develop in certain ways, and we realize shit that we could ignore when we were kids. So there's that. We see that, and then we obviously have that long conversation of Narat with that's kind of the question there. Maybe Anistia, maybe not, or the ghost of Anistia, which kind of also time shifts again into the spirit of Yeda and Derek, which is kind of all over the place. But we see something here that world building wise, we have the idea of the dragon that was killed. That was Mianas or Minas, however you want to pronounce it, being the lover of Galanas, the dragon Galanas, who was killed to get the blood, and thus the power of Corelled Galen. So we see more of the linkage between dragons and specific aspects of power, which is an interesting thing for me right now. Because when I looked at it, like the way I understood it is that Karul and Skill and Dro are currently seeking out dragons to bind them to certain aspects of power, of magic, of Karul's blood. But the murder or like the slaughter or the killing of Galenus, binding his power to the blood, like his blood to, or his blood being already aspected, kind of goes against the idea that this like aspect, like binding, still needs to happen. So I'm, yeah, maybe I'm just like dumb and don't understand it, but it feels like it's a bit weird there. But maybe I'll like get it later on. We'll see. So yeah. Then we have that conversation about the god of hate, or hatred being a god and revenge being a god, and one easy to feed and so forth, and Glyph promising that he will kill Narat once like their fight is over, which kind of shows me, I guess, that Glyph knows that Narat was part of the group of soldiers that slew Glyph's family. I think. Well, we'll see. Still, it's all in all a very like dark chapter, I feel, especially with the ending, that being the attack, the treacherous attack on the Yanis monastery, where everyone gets killed, and we finally see how great fighters the monks of the Sheikh actually are. Doesn't help them though, because they get murdered in their sleep, most of them. Yeah, just the idea that like war is very little of war is actually is one of the small things when we have the sergeant there who also burned Sanderlef's mother, and was like they burnt down the Drokorlat estate. That sergeant reflecting on the fact that most of war is not actually glorious battles or anything. Most of it is just atrocities and burning down places and so forth. Yeah, it's a fact. War isn't glorious, which kind of ties in with that main theme that we've seen at the beginning already, that like a poetic representation of war is always like despicable because it paints the wrong picture. At least that goes for like your heroic war depictions. I mean, there's obviously your like Robert Graves and your like Dulce Decorum Est and stuff like that, where you're like, yeah, no, war ain't really cool. But those are written by people who have actually been there in war. All right. So what's up in chapter 18? The beginning is incredible about the statue because there's so much packed into that passage. We have obviously the overall metaphor of the statue, or like that bronze of the dogs like turning in, and maybe it all being representations of the same dog and the same hound tearing itself apart, and that obvious like a parallel to Theist society, or any kind of society declining into civil war, but also the overall like the argument, like the idea that art, that the way the Theist produced art that was striving for perfection, and we've seen that. I mean, we see that a lot in like classical statuary and stuff like that. The striving for perfection, or the idea of art being something of a competition and having like more skilled artists. This is something that we still see in our societies, right? But like we have countries that are like proud of having the best painters. I don't know, probably the Dutch or the French, or for like your classical painters or what have you. And Germany is like very proud of its like poets and philosophers. Like the fuck? Like seriously, that's so fucking stupid because it does something with art. That art is never meant to be. Art is not about competition. Art is about like personal expression. And this is like the other side of it, and that we also have in that discussion later on when Rise Harat says that, or like thinks that, the point that as long as we as appreciators of art can make interpretations of a piece of artwork, as long as we can do that, art is not dead. And that is like the very, very important bit. There's like anything that we can take some personal like thoughts out of, like feelings, thoughts, and whatnot, ideas. That's what art is very much about. That also means that like physical perfection is never the goal. Physical perfection leaves very, very little room for the imagination, the fantasy, and ideas, because it is so yeah, physically perfect. It's the imperfections that spark our imagination, our minds, which, you know, is a really interesting aspect there that I found fascinating and interesting. But that chapter in general has a lot of things to talk about. We have obviously Endes Silan walking into the market and freeing all the birds. And there's like very interesting aspects in there that we need to think about when it comes to today's society, right? Endes Silan is highly privileged. He is a priest of the citadel. Thus, he is privileged. People down there in the winter market selling birds, trappers that catch those birds and so forth, are not privileged. As soon as I talk about birds, that crow starts yelling. Anyway, my point being that for privileged people in the position of someone like Endes Silan, it is very, very easy to claim the moral high ground. It is affordable for them, leaving completely out of like consideration that the people that they are castigating for their supposedly immoral behavior are maybe economically dependent on that. You know, it's like it's very easy for us in our like well appointed Western houses to castigate like working conditions or castigate like behaviors in other parts of the world when like where items are produced and then decline buying those or and so forth, and we barely think about the fact that not buying those actually harms people that have like no other choice but to do jobs that we might find morally problematic or reprehensible in a way. This I feel is one of the aspects that kind of gets lost in the story, because then we go to the whole idea of decency and whatnot. But Endes Silan's moral outrage is only possible or like easy for him because he is in a situation where he doesn't have any like economical constraints. I don't know how the economy for the priesthood in Corel Galen works. We never learned that, but it's like very, very easy to see that none of the people in that in that fortress, in that citadel, like actually work for their food. It just gets provided. They're all noble. They're all like the elite. They're like maybe not like actually noble, although Endes Silan is, I guess. But they're all privileged as fuck. They get like they get their food for free. They get like everything they want for free, and that's exactly the problem. There, it's like it's very easy from that position to forbid the catching of animals and selling of live animals. That's like super easy. because you don't think about like what happens to the people that have built their entire existence on that. And Corel Ghislaine is not the kind of country that offers like unemployment money and stuff like that, while those people can train to get new jobs. That's not how it works. Like, you're a trapper, you're no longer a trapper. You die, you starve or freeze to death. Because Enda Silan is now has now a clean conscience because he doesn't think about you. He only thought about the birds. That being said, we also once again have that idea of overhunting, because the seller of the birds obviously mentions that those birds are getting fewer every year, which, you know, is one of those themes that we see with Stephen Erickson all the time. So yeah, what else? Peace. The idea of ultimate peace, the conversation that he has with Silana, who finally shows up, which is really cool. And this is like the first and only time, like so far, the first time that Silana actually speaks, because she never speaks in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I think, unless I've missed something. But the main idea there being that bringing peace to people, giving peace, ultimate peace, has the dark side effect that once you've known that bliss and peace, that release, and you go back to life, it is very, very hard, because if that is actually ultimate release, it really, like, and you know you will no longer be able to feel that until the time you die, makes it very, very painful to give that release and that peace up, which is once again, you know, Enda Silan is not the brightest man in that. He may be one of the most empathetic men in Corel Ghislaine, but he's certainly not the brightest. I can tell you, not the sharpest knife in the drawer there. Which is good, because his hands are already bleeding. Anyway, my point being, while the whole miracle and his intentions are really good, we see him causing a lot of harm unintentionally, which, I don't know if there's like any lesson in there. Just like, you know, think about what you're doing before you do it, I guess. Another thing that I feel we need to talk about is Cedarpool, and the beginning of how the rise of magic in Corel Ghislaine, and the beginning of what you might call an arms race, a magical arms race between the powers of dark and the powers of light. Everyone trying to be as sorcery as possible, because they figure it's going to be a magical battle, and whoever has the bigger magical guns will win. Side note, the best magical guns are the guns of Avalon, but that's like a different thing. Anyway, my point is, we see how fear and like a hierarchy there, the structure and hierarchy is shifting, and it ends kind of with the idea like, how does it feel to be superfluous, for when what Silta's Ruin asks Emma Lanier, or whatever her name is, the high priestess. But the point is, the lower ranks, mostly Cedarpool at this point, are playing their own game and are no longer actually considering what Mother Dark or the high priestess want, because they perceive the necessity to do so, which brings us back to that theme of necessity being one of the really terrible ideas, really terrible arguments for anything. Yeah. What else do we get? I mean, we see Draconis build the wagon, which is interesting. We also get a bit of diverse action and all of that stuff. Mother Dark actually speaks, which is cool, although she only speaks to Draconis. Yeah. We see, you know, we officially get confirmation that Draconis is an Azathanai, so there's that. I don't know. I think there's more, and I just forgot it because I'm an idiot. but maybe I'll remember it by tomorrow, and then I'll just like weave it in. If not, I wish you all a great Monday evening and a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow about more Fall of Light. And until then, cheers.